Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Gene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs.
Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Gene Signorini, and I'm excited for today's episode. Today's guest is an advocate of the learning and talent management industry for more than 30 years. He helps companies implement strategic digital transformation and human capital management programs that improve process, reduce expenses, and drive bottom line revenues. I'm pleased to welcome the founder and CEO of Bluewater, Chris Bond. Chris, thanks for joining the program today.
Gene, great to be here.
So, Chris, I know you've tuned in a couple of times to our program, and you're a friend of us here at Skillful. So this question won't come as a surprise. It's something we kind of ask everybody on the program, but I'd love to get your perspective from where you sit, particularly in kind of the learning and development space, which is, what do you see as the biggest challenge that's facing the frontline and deskless workforce today?
That's a great question, and something that I think is growing significantly, especially as we look at organizations that are trying to figure out, do we work in the office? Do we send people at home? What does that look like? What the piece that I think that they're missing in that is that 60 to 65% of the workforce is all deskless, and they've been at jobs. So even during the pandemic, manufacturing organizations were there, retail had to get back in, restaurant service had to get back in, hospitality had to get back in, and those that travel for business and jobs as well. So those that are not sitting at a desk, those deskless workers, I believe that the biggest challenge today is that they're finally getting recognized, and in that recognition that they're different than somebody that sits behind a desk, they're discovering how underserved they've been over a period of time. And now we're seeing demand pick up, and most organizations don't have the capacity or ability to begin to go address what the real needs are of the deskless worker in a new work environment. I think it's a critical issue for a significant number of companies that are out there that they've got to find a way to begin to focus on and resolve fairly quickly, or they're going to begin losing the attention, the focus, and the capability of the individual employee. So that's piece one. If I can go on to the 2 and 3 here real quick.
Sure.
The second we look at as one of those critical items that really is being missed as a part of that process is that we hear about all the skill development that has to go on. And skills are critical to knowing either your product or your process. You've got to be able to do that. It's not just the compliance training, but product or process. The intent of making it easy for a deskless worker to be able to consume training, I think, is very, very difficult. And again, a lot of that focus on, hey, we need to do skills upgrades and skills development goes to the desk worker, not the deskless worker. And then I think the third piece is that we see most organizations that have deskless workers are woefully underserved in terms of having learning and talent technology to be able to support them. They're used to, hey, let's go do it in a classroom. Let's do on-the-job training. Let's do training just in time before you do a task. And that really, with the speed of change and transition in the world today, is not something that's going to be easy to be able to administer and measure and show valuable progress for a lot of organizations as well. So three things there I gave you that I think are really big challenges for the deskless worker population.
No, that's great. And I think we could probably spend an hour talking about each of those topics, but I
Yep.
can't wait to dig in on a few of them. There's one thing you said, when you talked about the fact that, frontline workers have recognized they're underserved, right? Their organizations, I think, are finally realizing that they've been underserved. But I think you use the term they don't have the capacity or the ability, right, to serve them. Can you elaborate on that? Like when you talk about capacity, is that resources? Is that ability? Is that technology? What are the elements that go into that? How would you describe that? Why are they falling short?
I think it goes back to real same thing we hear all the time, which is people, process, technology. All three are gaps. Now, when you look at in one of the areas, quick serve restaurant industry, they actually do a really good job with deskless workers in providing training. But you got to teach somebody at a Chick-fil-A on how to go cook the chicken properly, or what's the company culture and how do we do these things. And so training has been built around an individual unit or store to be able to drive that forward. And so the mechanism is there to be able to press that out very, very quickly, from a delivery standpoint. But it's not necessarily there for a lot of these organizations from a design standpoint, in terms of how am I going to design learning to be able to be consumed by somebody in that deskless environment. So that's part of the people issue is do we have the idea of the design and design resources to be able to go do that? Because the majority of the people that have been building and constructing training and training programs, they're very, very focused on how do I deliver it to the desk worker, not the deskless worker. And what we do know is that there's a gap. So if you try to just, oh, I'm going to modify my desk worker training for a deskless worker, you're missing a lot of context about that individual and what they are and what they do. So that's the people side. The process side is really all around change. So organizations that have a great ability to go change or transform in the business do this very, very well, and they're able to transform or update. But those organizations that have deskless workers that now have numerous units or numerous facilities, manufacturing, delivery, even deskless remote workers, then how do I begin to provide that education to them? I don't have a process for getting out and delivering that training and that content. Instead, and just as an example, so power generation companies, we work with a number of them, and those power generation companies, the way that they solve that problem is not finding a process to be able to get the training out to the deskless worker. It's calling the deskless worker into a desk environment in order to be able to provide training. So it's a process area and a process problem that exists. And then finally is technology. And this one we could probably, you had mentioned, we could probably spend an hour on each. This one we could spend about a month just having a conversation about technology. And technology is a barrier for delivering training to a deskless worker. So how are we going to deliver that? We're going to put kiosks out in deskless areas? Are we going to ask them to use their own mobile devices? Are we going to bring in mobile devices from the organization to be able to train them? One manufacturing company we work with, they've got what they call a bunch of cows that are out there. So computers on wheels. How are we going to bring all the cows around in order to be able to train? But even that, it's limited because on a manufacturing floor, they may only have 3 cows and 200, 300, 400 workers that are out there. So what are they going to do in order to deliver that training, especially as you try to do more learning in the flow of work? Oh, let's build a training room on the manufacturing floor, and we'll bring people off the line in order to be able to learn. And so now technology becomes a barrier because we don't have a mechanism to be able to deliver that right training in the flow of work. And we're again relying on taking deskless workers and bringing them back to a desk environment in order to train them. And I think that there's huge opportunity those organizations that look at that people, process, and technology and find a way to begin to transition to a deskless worker training environment that can be incredibly impactful for the individuals, that connects them with the company. So they're like, this is a group that really cares about my future and wants to work with me and develop me over a period of time. That's a different world in what are typically in deskless work environments, really high turnover. So how do you begin to lower that turnover, get more long-term connectivity? I think solving that people, process, and technology issue is at the forefront for a lot of organizations that are out there. There's great solutions, and some people have done pieces of it, but I still think it's a gap.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to the technology piece and some of the processes that you see have been successful, um, because I think that's going to be really important to dive into. It's funny you kind of talk about the learning in the flow work and pulling people out, into a classroom environment. It reminds me of the movie. I don't know if you're familiar, Princess Bride, and there's a phrase in there. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means, right?
Yeah.
So it's not exactly in the flow of work, right? If you're pulling people, out of the flow of work. But, there's this other thing. You talked about the quick serve restaurants, right? That are doing, I think, a very good job, of training. And I think, and maybe I'd love to kind of get your perspective on this, because I think that many frontline organizations or L&D teams, or even the frontline leadership, operations leadership, does a pretty good job of the training piece, the upfront training, whether it's onboarding or not, or at least giving them some of the tools that they need to get. Not perfect, right? But I think a lot, let's put it this way. I think that's where a lot of the emphasis is, right, on that upfront training. But as you know, as a learning professional, right, when we talk about learning, you mentioned skills development, right, and ongoing skills development. That's where there seems to be a tremendous gap, right? And where, when you're hiring a new employee, right, you can, part of the process, you can take them into a classroom, right? Or you can have them at the depot and learning, or you can do a ride along or something like that. But it's when they're on their own, when they're in the flow of work, or when, now you want to introduce some new business process, a new workflow, so a new safety bulletin that they need to understand, a new technology that you're rolling out. That's where there seems to be a big gap in the learning process. And part of that, what we've heard at least, and I'm interested in, is time, right? Is they just don't have time. So how do you think about that? I mean, is that something first of all, is that something that you've seen as well? Is that one of the kind of big challenges that you think organizations need to try to overcome, and maybe that's where the big part of the underserving is finding itself?
Time is this really interesting measurement that I think it's hard to quantify value. We know it's incredible. Time is incredibly valuable, but when we look at that and say we don't have time in order to be able to do that type of training, the thing that we're missing is what's the utility of return that happens if we actually spend the time in training or development in terms of productivity. And I think that there's a time piece that's in there, and I don't know how to really articulate or measure it. But if I'm looking, I say, well, I'm going to take Gene and Chris off of the manufacturing floor for 30 minutes and train them, and I'm going to commit that time, then what happens to the productivity and the longevity of their career within an organization if we do that? And I believe the focus is much more on productivity around producing the product versus what's the longer term view of what happens there. So I'm going to give you just a little bit. We divide all the training and learning and development into 4 separate segments. So there is the initial training, which is you got to know process, you got to know product, you got to get onboarded, you got to be compliant. That is a training activity that always has to happen in an organization. But then there's the next element, which is how do I reinforce that training? How do I expand that initial training that I did begin to expand skills, expand capabilities, give them more of that learning in the flow of work so they can perfect and improve their skills. Because everybody needs to perfect and improve their skills, but also show value to the employee. Then the third piece is really now getting in to the development side. So, Gene, I'll train you on how to do a job, but am I willing to invest time to be able to develop you for a future and a career inside the organization? That's the third piece. And that's where we see real skill attainment happening. And then the fourth is now, how do we get you into a long-term collaborative environment where those people that have gone through the training and the reinforcement and the development are now building each other up and their skills up and advancing what they do as an organization? The things that you now gain because you gave up the time are, yes, I got increases in productivity, but it may be that that individual stays inside the company for another 2 to 3 years. There is a valuable measurement against what that means to be able to have that person around in productivity, and the fact that you don't have to spend a lot of money on cost or replacement and those type of activities. And you typically are going to have a much, much happier, friendlier workforce that's not in a combative environment, but in a really joyful, hey, we're building the culture of the company together type environment. So the companies we see that say, yeah, I'm going to invest the time, there is a dramatic impact, but it's not going to be seen in the next 3, 6, 12 months. It's going to be seen in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years. And I think people have to determine, what am I going to invest for? Is it just in this moment of time, or is in the moments of time that are going to happen over the next year, 2 years, 3 years? Again, organizations that invest long-term in that thought process around training, boy, you can see a dramatic impact on their business. Those that are like, I just don't have time right now to do that, they're the ones that are, what's the old story that, back in the Fortune 500 back in the 50s, there's only 20% of those people that are still in the Fortune 500 today. I think they ran out of time.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. You talk about those four, what you call 4 pillars or 4 elements of learning. Do you see them as stages of growth for companies? Meaning, do companies really have to kind of go through a progression, say they have to be good at training or see the value from training before they can move on to the next? Not saying that's the right way to do it, but do you see that there's kind of a maturity that companies say, okay, we're very mature here, we do a great job of onboarding, but it's that expansion, right? We're seeing that there are little things that we're missing in the onboarding and we need to give people more capabilities. And maybe some companies do that well and say, okay, now it's time, how do we extract more value out of our employees? Is that kind of the way it progresses, or have you seen some companies successfully kind of overhaul their entire approach to learning and development, for example?
Well, I definitely have seen companies that have overhauled their entire approach and have had dramatic impact. You mentioned something, and it just kind of made me think when you said, well, they can be really good on onboarding, but they're not very good at expansion. Typically, those companies that struggle with learning and training the most have marginal to awful onboarding programs. They've got a great, I'm going to train you on the process on the product, but they're not onboarding you into the organization. You're walking in, diving into the deep end of the ocean and saying, here's what you're going to do. We're going to teach you exactly how to operate this machine. And that's what's considered onboarding. It's not concept, philosophy, engaging the learner in the process, in the company. It's I'm going to focus on process. This is how you create the product. Ready, set, go, which immediately sets up for a very, very short-term employment gig. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So we've got an organization that we worked with, very, very large organization, and they did a great job on training on product and process. Everybody in the organization knew their product and their process. They were hiring between 9 and 10,000 new employees per year. So big organization. At the end of 12 months, the problem they came to us with was their retention rate on a highly skilled worker, but deskless worker environment was 38%.
Hmm.
So 38% was their retention number, not their turnover number, their retention number. So now you're less than 40% retention. Your cost is going through the roof on recruiting and replacing those individuals that you were expecting to come in as highly skilled workers in order to be able to do a job. The next piece, as you go down and look years out, is those 38% that were retained were going to leave the company within 2 years because they saw all of the people that they had joined with also exiting the company, and they recognized that there was a problem. Well, what was the problem? They had a great process and product training program, but they never onboarded you into the organization. They never said, hey, Gene, here's the way that we're going to develop you for the future of the business. It's going to take us a while to be able to get there. But we look at that in a different way. And so they had really high turnover. Conversely, got another organization we worked with that they had an incredible philosophy. So as you enter into the organization, you're immediately put into a 3-year training and development program. That's stage number one. 3-year training and development program. So I have my plan for the next 3 years, how I'm going to be trained, what the development path is. There's multiple paths. I can see what they are, and I try to attain that. But then they also said, and at the end of 3 years, we're going to assess you and find out whether you're going to be just one of the people who works at the company, or we're going to put you in our 12-year development program. Right? And what were they doing there? They were really trying to focus on providing a long-term outlook on being at their company. Now, they still would probably have people that would leave in 18 months on the first one, or they might leave in 5 to 10 years, but their organizational turnover in a field-based organization was really, really low. Why? Because those employees felt like somebody had invested in them and had thought about the fact that we want to keep you around for a long time. I just think that's magical in terms of looking at where those paths are, and the level of productivity that they got out of those people was fantastic. By the way, those 3 and 10, 12-year development programs, they weren't that complicated. They were pretty straightforward, but it showed people that you're willing to invest versus the other company that said, I'm training you on product and process. That's it. I'm not really onboarding you. I don't have a long-term career path. And now you're seeing 62%, 62% annualized exiting of the business. And at that level, that means that they've got to go back and replace between 5,000 and 6,000 employees on an annual basis at a cost of about $5,000 per employee. That's millions of dollars that's wasted and out the door. Now I look at that and say, I need to take the time to be able to go train these people so that they've got an opportunity to be able to stay here for a while. What happens if you reduce attrition rate by 10%? What does that do to productivity? What does that do to your long-term outlooks for your company? And in the meantime, it's saving you a lot of money.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I love that story. You talk about, establishing that plan early on. I think it probably then, creates this, it creates this notion that, listen, part of my job, right, is to learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of my job, right, is to continually develop and to learn. So you're embedding it not just, we call it embedding it in the culture, but you're essentially embedding it in the role. Like everybody's job at this organization, right, is to continue to grow, is to continue to learn, is to continue to develop their skills, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's it's a really interesting approach.
Yeah, that idea of, um, you always had CPI, continued processes of improvement of the company. That's great, but how do we go down and look at it and communicate that to the individual that I want to have continued process of improvement for Chris? And I think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing such an uptick in the idea of skill development is not just because we want to have new skills so we can continue to do the jobs that are changing so rapidly. That's important. But I think that there's a lot of employees that are like, if I can just add a few skills on a regular basis, then I know that it's valuable for me to be here because I'm improving myself. That's a different way to look at it
Yeah.
from, hey, company needs skills for the future, so let's go train everybody on skills, versus looking at it from the individual and saying the individual's desire is to add skills because now they can see growth and improvement in their self. That's phenomenally valuable.
I hope you found this conversation as informative as I have. Please stay tuned for part 2 of my conversation with Chris Bond, which will be launching shortly, and where we'll discuss how the learning technology stack is evolving, how organizations can maximize technology to engage and develop their frontline organizations, and how companies can measure the impact of learning and training on their operations. Please feel free to leave a comment on the Frontline Innovators LinkedIn page with ideas you may have for future themes and topics. And a friendly reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the only end-to-end systems training platform optimized for frontline operations. You can learn more about how you can solve your frontline systems training challenges by visiting skillful.com. That's SKYFULL.com. Thank you, and I look forward to joining you on our next episode.